Hello and welcome to everybody. I am Dr. Usman Chohan, President HYPIA, and today I have the supreme privilege of celebrating a moment of academic breakthrough with a dear friend of mine who is also Director of Research at HYPIA and the Hyperpolyglot activist, Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Dr. Usman Chohan. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's all mine. Today, what we're having a little conversation about, sharing our mini triumph about, is a book that is coming out this year, coming out soon, on non-fungible tokens, NFTs. And the title is Non-Fungible Tokens, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. So what I'm happy to share with you, share with the audience, is that this book was a combined effort with a lot of authors from multiple disciplines. There was two people from Pakistan, one from Canada, one from Italy, one from France, one from Finland, one from Ireland, four from South Africa, one from the United States, and then there's one guy from Spain. And this a guy from Spain has also done a remarkable chapter using the linguistics perspective, which is unique among the other perspectives. Generally, the book focused on either the economics of it, sociology, or technology. And it's concentrated with the objective that all of us try to dissect non-fungible tokens from many angles so that we have a lasting tome on the subject that future scholars can refer to as the one place to understand NFTs. And in that regard, let's hear from you about what your chapter was and how did you go about this business?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Well, first of all, let me also thank you for your leadership and editorial skills, for the feedback provided while I was authoring this chapter, always within a busy schedule. So that is much appreciated. Now, let's dive into the chapter in question. My chapter is chapter 10, which features a rather convoluted title, which is as follows: The Fetishizing Language Behind the NFT Craze, a Semiotic-cum-Semantic Critique. What I hope is that by the end of my explanation, it will be clear what the title means, and therefore the content of the chapter by extension. And so the chapter is motivated by my initial fascination with the speculative nature of NFTs, right? So we know that there was an NFT bubble between 2020 and 2022, particularly remarkable in 2021, and then the bubble bursts and we were left with the consequences of it. How do we make sense of what happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? And how can we move forward from that, right? And in the chapter, I argued that the idea that purely virtual objects can be worth millions of dollars was reflected in and aided by the conceptualization of NFTs as digital assets. And that conceptualization was faulty. And we can analyze that from a semiotic perspective and from a semantic perspective. The conceptualization was faulty because what are NFTs? As you said, these are non-fungible tokens. The fact that they are non-fungible means that they are unique. The fact that they are unique means that they are scarce. And that can be interpreted, it can be read, and it was read as meaning that they have value, and therefore, from that, it can be surmised that they are inherently valuable, which they're not, as the bursting of the bubble demonstrated. So there you go. The non sequitur is that because they were scarce, they are inherently valuable. And it's a non sequitur, is a fallacy, it is a logic failure, because scarcity is a necessary condition of value, but not a sufficient one. And so when I break down how the way in which the media spoke about NFTs reflected and aided that hype, I carry out a semiotic-cum-semantic critique. What is semiotics? It's the study of signs, right? The study of representation. And what is representation? Is that which links a signifier to the signified, right? The signifier is the vehicle, and the signified is the referent, that which is represented by the vehicle. And what I argue in the chapter is that there is a postmodern crisis of representation, which translates into the fact that there is a worshipping and fetishization, hence the title of the chapter, of the signifier at the expense of the signified. We focus more and more on representations of things rather than those very things. And so this gives way to self-referentiality. And that semiotic decalage is the one that I criticize in the chapter. Once you have disentangled what NFTs represent from what NFTs actually are, you can sell people on the dream of NFTs as being actual digital assets. And that's what the media did, helped by the fact that there was an injection of money within the context of the quote-unquote pandemic, which meant that people had more disposable income. And what did they do with that? They went to Amazon, but they also acquired CryptoPunks and monkeys with blue eyes and a pink cap. So they also invested into NFTs. When that money stopped coming in, then that also contributed to the bursting of the bubble, right? And within that media campaign, what we have is a semantic ruse. What is that semantic ruse? Is the metaphorization of NFTs and the replacement of that metaphor for the reality, the literal meaning of NFTs. And as Nietzsche said, concepts are metaphors whose origins we have forgotten. So we have the treatment of NFTs as if they were digital assets, which is different from the fact that they are putative digital assets, and then the replacement of that treatment as the genuine reality of NFTs. That is the semantic displacement that I critique in the chapter. And I conclude that beyond the semiotic ruse, beyond the semantic sleight of hand, there are structural problems underlying the functioning of NFTs, notably what is known in the literature as the linkage problem and the last mile problem. And it has to do with the fact that the relationship between NFTs and the works of art that they refer to is not exactly the same as the relationship between intellectual property rights and physical works of art in the offline realm. And the question is whether one could overcome those difficulties in a blockchain environment. We don't know. That might be the case, but we're not there yet.
Excellent. Excellent. Your excellent summary of your chapter helps me now to provide a overview of the ambition that was there and where this chapter fit. This chapter of yours fit very nicely in part 3 of the book. Part 3 was the one that tried to say, whoa, wait a minute, this NFT stuff is not just a source of value, it's a source of disvalue or public value destruction. You have to be very careful with NFTs. The first part of the book just gives people the understanding, the overview. It tells you what the technology is, what its history has been so far, which is a short but like very rich history. And then also it talks about aspects related to the mathematics of NFTs. For example, what are the correlations between NFTs and other cryptos or other assets? Let's look at the graphs and understand how these prices move together. So there's a mathematical, that's the introduction. Part 2 says, let's look at some of the possibilities, which among many of them are critiqued in part 3, your part 3, where your chapter exists. In part 2 is particularly concerned with the possibilities. For example, if you can improve the environmental social governance indicators, you would already be doing a huge favor to digital assets. Or look at how we are not in late stage capitalism, we're not about societies of consumers anymore. We're societies of producers. We just go about producing for the hell of producing. That's our relationship to late capitalism, for just for the sake of it, as well as a benefit such as the dynamic NFTs. You have static NFTs right now, but imagine as Web 3.0 comes out and the NFT is actually an interactive sphere rather than this clunky little image of blue-eyed monkeys, like you said, or cartoonish, whatever, unicorns. It's a different world with dynamic interactivity, as well as an advantage that said, look at the subcultures. You have a whole different community within the larger cryptocurrency world. And what are the traits of these people? It's interesting, for example, how apolitical they are, but how unideological they are, how goofy they are, etc. Subcultural traits. That's part two. Then part three was the sobriety that, okay, you can have all of this cool stuff, but be very careful. I contributed a chapter that said, look at all these hacks and phishing things and scams and all this garbage that happens. Straight up, that's the simplest one in disadvantages. Then you have one about the spectacle of accumulation. You're just going about gathering stuff that's all virtual for the hell of it, the spectacle of it all. And you also had a good one about the exploitation, which I think when you read it, you will really find it interesting. Trevor Zaucha says, look at who owns these NFTs, like Axie Infinity, a video game. You have a bunch of people sitting in America or Europe who own the Axie character, like a Pokemon. And then you have people in like the Philippines who are busy all day making their Axies good for them. So in Europe and America, you have the owner and the worker is in the Philippines, the reproduction of traditional systems in the digital sphere. And then we come to your part where you said, okay, they said all this stuff about the digital asset, but then they actually have this in reality. And when you conflate the imagined with the real in NFTs, you get a whole lot of room to sell people nonsense. That's the sober part. What do you now give? I've given you a spoiler for your thing because you haven't seen the full book yet. What do you think about the editorial vision by structuring it this way?
Yeah, the editorial vision makes a lot of sense because not everybody is going to be familiarized with NFTs and their trajectory. So the first part is very much needed. And then the second one is also necessary. But the third one, the sobriety, it's both necessary and risky because as we were writing this book, we didn't know what the evolution of the NFT market was going to be like. So we were, in a sense, also speculating, right, in a meta speculation game. But I think that our intuitions turn out to be right as of early 2024. We don't know what the future holds, but there were claims, for instance, back in 2022, early 2023, as we were writing the book, that the crypto market will tend to evolve in parallel with the NFTs because at the end of the day, both were speculative assets, etc., etc. But as I argued in the chapter, there's something unique to the rules behind NFTs, right? There are structural problems that do not necessarily recur in the case of cryptos, which made me to believe that their evolution was not going to be necessarily parallel. And I'm glad to see that this is with the recent explosion of cryptocurrencies in early 2024, which has not been accompanied by a parallel increase of the NFT market value. So I think that we took a gamble and we succeeded.
That's a good way to put it.
But in that sense, I will say in regards to your question that part three is perhaps the riskiest part. Yeah.
You know, it is the riskiest, but it's also the most informative. The analyses of not my chapter. Mine's pretty straightforward, but the three that are in part three, I think, are the ones that really open your eyes to the depth of it. The one on spectacle of accumulation is really like, okay, this is the end of the world, and you're just holding virtual rocks at the end of the apocalypse. The one about exploitation says, okay, you've got this very cute thing happening. It is exactly like the Marxist exploitation of the outsourced banana republic. And the third one, which is yours, in order, actually, yours comes first. Yours is chapter 10, and I'm talking about 11 and 12. So your chapter 10, yours says is that, wow, you created this illusion, and you have the actual functionality just bound till here. And yet you can make people think that to sell them this. And that is a totally so yes, you're correct that they're risky, but these three really open eyes and they actually set the precedent for deeper analysis into the virtual sphere, which means like cryptos as a whole, which means DAOs if you're into that stuff. My book 8 is going to be on DAOs. All of this stuff has this shadow, this large shadow of ruses as a collective. And I think yours is very solid in that regard because rhetoric versus praxis, or the semiotics, the real and the sign and the signifier, for example, they are the most relevant for other things that are going to happen over this decade at the very least. And so my ambition is that, and I'll ask your opinion on this.
Mhm.
My ambition is that if there is such a thing as NFTs, then our work on NFTs is what people should be checking out. Like if you're interested, this is your go-to place for it. Do you think that this will serve that purpose? Have we accomplished this purpose?
Only the audience will judge, but I believe so. If you ask me, I think that it has every ingredient that is necessary for the book to become a go-to place when it comes to getting to know what NFTs are all about. Because it not only presents NFTs, but it also problematizes them. And that critical edge is necessary and scarce. And just because it's scarce doesn't mean it's inherently valuable, but it's almost the case. So yeah, it is, I think it has all the ingredients are there. In the end, how will it function in the market? We don't know. As Derrida said, we create things and then we cannot control the effects. But I do believe that it has all the traits of a reference book for NFTs. Absolutely. And I also wanted to ask you about the parallels between NFTs and languages. Because when you refer to chapters that talk about the spectacle of accumulations, I cannot help but think of how people accumulate languages nowadays in the polyglot community slash industry. And when you talk about the exploitation, I cannot help but think about how the global market of the polyglots community slash industry relies on the global north projecting universalist ideas that nonetheless require a lot of exploitation from the global south.
Very profound parallels you're drawing without without spoilers. No
Yeah.
spoilers. Let's just put it this way, and then you give a more a detailed answer if you like, as team leader, um, for a certain project. The ideas that you are extracting from the messaging vis-a-vis NFTs are critiques and approaches that apply to capital as a whole. Capital in its most, especially in its most intangible forms. Its intangible forms include these digital currencies and these digital objects. They also include capital of the mind. The mind capital includes things like language acquisition, and perhaps there is something for us to look for in spectacle of accumulation for the sake of it, as well as with the exploitation, as well as with, hey, think about this, the sign versus signified in language acquisition. So I think you're foreshadowing some heavy stuff, man. What do you think?
Yeah, lots to dig in there. But and at the same time, I think that your early comment on my chapter as a microcosm of further problems to come down the line, it's also remarkable because in the end, we are talking about the gap between the digital and the offline. You know, back in the day, the lingo used to be real life versus digital life. Nowadays, only very benighted analysts refer to the digital or the online world as not real. I feel like this is a late 20th century lingo rather than an early 21st lingo. But
True.
even in going back to languages, language exchange events, you can hear that a lot. Like, oh, we're finally meeting IRL in real life.
Mm.
Is the exchange of language in the virtual realm not real?
Mm. It's a good point.
Mhm.
It's a good point. For example, we've only met in person once, and yet there's so many projects we're working on. Isn't that
Right.
real? You see the
Yeah.
physical manifestation when this book on NFTs gets sent to you. Of course it is. So I take your point very well. Is there something else you want to add on this point about languages and the critiques that or the approaches that were taken in the NFT book, including semiotics or spectacle or exploitation? Is there something more you want to add on this?
Yeah, I would just like to add perhaps that when writing the chapter, I felt that the intersection between critical linguistics and propaganda studies is a very fruitful one. When it comes to making sense of persuasion, of which the NFT craze is a very important demonstration and symptom at the same time, we need to approach that from a what interdisciplinary perspective. right? Critical linguistics, yes, but also propaganda studies. How are people persuaded at a mass scale? And how does that interact with material and economic conditions? If you want to understand economy, you need to understand the political exploitation of language. That's what I hope people get from that chapter.
Absolutely. And no spoilers, but there's plenty for the world to gain from more interaction between two specific disciplines, which is the linguistics folks and the economics folks. They live on two opposite planets, but we're going to prove to them that there is quite fruitful exploration on that front. And one final question regarding this. So, Hypia is leader on research. Uh, Here's one small example of one mini great exploit that we have a chapter that is part of a larger corpus that is at least head by President Hypia, although it's not linguistics per se. So isn't this something very cool for Hypia to know that its research arm, which is under your leadership, is doing great stuff? It's not glamorous, but when you finally see the product, you see, wow, this was the real deal happening quietly this whole time. Your comments as Hypia
and
Director of
and that
Research.
and that is the beauty of collaboration, and the reason why I feel so much appreciation for the fact that I'm able to collaborate as director of HYPIA Research, because we are putting a dent into the universe and crossing over disciplines and categories. And we have obviously a very prominent side of community outreach. We have organized plenty of research meetings. The Brighton aspect is different. As you said, it's more quiet, it's more silent, but it's no less difficult. So this chapter, and hopefully many other projects that will come soon, are underlined by a consistent, silent, but extremely important analysis, which sometimes may or may not happen at the expense of certain community outreach projects, but that are complementary and supplementary to them. So they are necessary in one word.
Absolutely right and well said. So, Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, thank you so much for your time, and let this be one of the many wonderful things we see in collaboration, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much, Dr. Usman Chohan. A pleasure.